Welcome back to our module on creating agile governance. So having laid out some of the principles in the first session, we're now going to look at a particular approach to agile governance that I've been working with in the past and that has been adopted by quite a number of companies in the last few years. It's based on something called holacracy, which came out of an agile software company originally, developing it to see how to make sure that as much of the diversity in the company, the different perspectives were included in decision making, and yet that the company was able to move forward, taking decisions really based in the present moment on what was needed rather than trying to execute big long-term plans. So I'd say that this is rather than a full, complete, accurate description of all the details of holacracy. It's rather my take on how I've experienced applying these concepts in the organization that I founded and led and that I've seen worked with in other areas. In the resource library, you'll be able to find more of the formal documents, and on their website, more of the concrete practices and things, and the latest working sheets and guidelines and everything that they work with. But this will give you a sense of how I've used it in the kind of contexts that we've been talking about. So here's a reminder of the principles that we touched on in the last session. And so I believe that an approach such as this one will help us to create the structures so that this kind of culture that reflect these principles can thrive. Because that's the real challenge. If you think about the integral model again and the 4 quadrants, it's how do we enable structure in the lower right to support the kind of culture that we want to create in the lower left so that we get that alignment. That's one of the greatest challenges, and that I think is what this kind of approach can help us with. So the key theme here is dynamic steering. And I referred to that in the previous session as the way you might ride a bicycle, where you've got your long-term goal in mind, but you're really focused on the present moment and making sure you don't bump into anything right in front of you. That's not the way we're used to running organizations. We're used to trying to work out what the future's going to look like, predict where we're going to be, and then make a plan and control our way forward and drive that plan through the organization. Well, that in these kind of change contexts simply doesn't work because things are moving so quickly that the moment you take a step, your plan is out of date because things have changed. So how do you work out how to run an organization when you can't plan your way forward, but you really have to navigate step by step as we move? It's something that we're not normally trained to do in our business schools, which is why the IBM survey identified these challenges, and we're saying it's so hard for us to find the kind of qualities that we need in particularly this kind of operating reality. So in dynamic steering, the key is to experiment and adapt. So we stay present the whole time with what's going on now, get the data from the present moment, and then that data informs how we move forward. So as we're riding our bike, we see something coming our way, that gives us information, and then we know what to do next to be able to avoid that obstacle and keep moving in the right general direction. So in a way, like we were talking about at individual level, the importance of being really present with the current moment. This is an organizational practice that helps the organization stay present with the current moment and not worry too much about the future and not get stuck in the past, but keep moving forward step by step. And as we take a step, we then stop and sense and see what implications that step has and then take the next step. So it releases a lot of pressure. When we were looking for the right kind of organizational form in the Center for Human Emergence in the Netherlands, which I founded, we kind of found ourselves going round and round in circles. We tried all these business planning approaches, all the kind of traditional tools, and none of them seemed to work. And when we found this approach, it really liberated us because it meant that we didn't have to work out, exactly what our strategy was going to be going forward, make a big plan, implement all of these concepts. We simply had to stay present with what was true now for us as an organization, get the information from that moment, and then take the next step, and then we'll see. So that's the liberation that it brings with it as a practice. And not only is it liberating for us as people, but it's actually far more effective in these very dynamic change contexts. So when we're thinking about decisions in dynamic steering, decision making is often a challenging process because everybody has their different perspectives and the ideas. And we're trying to get to a point where we feel we've really got the best decision. So, we have conversations about, well, if we take this decision now, then what might be the implications 6 months down the line? And, oh yeah, I hadn't thought about that. And you're working with a lot of unknown variables if you're speculating about the future. In this approach, what's most important is a workable decision. And what a workable decision is one that works for now. So what you're asking people as you look to take a decision is, will this decision work for now? Or does anybody see a major problem to us doing this now in terms of the impact it will have now based on everything we know? And if it's workable for now, then we take the decision because we can always revisit it the next day or the next week. So what's workable for now? Take it, move forward, see what happens when we take that decision, gather the data, and that informs our next step. So any issue can be revisited at any time. You don't have to worry about taking a decision and it being stuck in stone for the next 2 or 3 years. You take a decision, that informs an action, that generates feedback and information that enables you to take the next step. So all that's important are tensions that are present now. Not speculation about the future, but given where we're at now with the organization, what are the things that are creating tensions in the system, and how can we start to move forward, find solutions that are workable now for those tensions? Should that not be working for us, then we can always fall back to predict and control, but only when that's really necessary and if we can't find a way to dynamically steer. So it doesn't completely exclude it, but the optimal governance system really allows us to dynamically steer our way forward. One of the other key principles in this approach is the principle of individual action, which I touched on briefly. What it means is that as an individual in the organization, often what happens is because the structure is so hierarchical, people are afraid to use their own initiative. And if they can't find a rule to define what they should do in a certain situation, they'll ask their boss or the one higher up the hierarchy what they should do, and they'll have to wait for an answer. Maybe they'll need to check with somebody higher up. And it takes a long time to go up the chain of command before the information comes back down again, and makes you highly inefficient as an agile organization. So the principle of individual action says that even if what you feel in the moment is the right thing to do, and that doesn't seem to fit with existing policies, that's still what you need to do. And that should that create stress or tension in the system, you need to be prepared to restore the balance. And what that means is maybe by doing what you do, you tread on one of your colleagues' toes, you somehow move into their domain. So you need to go to them and explain the situation and ask them if there's anything you can do to restore the balance. Or it may be that it creates a tension because you felt that was really the right thing to do in that moment and it proved to be so, but it runs counter to the policies that we've agreed with each other in the organization. So what you do then is you take that as a tension. That's a classic example of a tension. I felt I needed to do that in the moment, it worked, and yet it's counter to the policies that we have. So you take that into one of the governance meetings and explore that with each other. So how does that moment inform how we need to evolve our policies to make them more adequate and appropriate? So there's 3 main sections of this approach: organizational control, organizational structure, and core practices for our meetings. So organization control looks at the dynamic steering approach. It's about how we actually control the organization. So we're trying to ride it like a bike. We're going to look at decision-making processes that try to integrate as much information as possible that's in the system so that we have the most informed decision as we move forward. And then in the principle of individual action, which I just talked about. And then for the structure, we're creating an organizational structure based on roles and accountabilities. And what that means is we ask ourselves, what does the organization really need to count on somebody to do in order to be able to move towards our vision, fulfilling our mission, and working by the principles that we've agreed on? What does the organization need to be able to count on someone to do? And those become accountability. So you can imagine a list of things. Well, it needs to be able to count on somebody to keep a track of the finances, needs to be able to count on somebody to oversee our marketing, needs to be able to count on somebody to really lead the development of our core product. So a number of different things right down into the concrete things that might need to happen. Needs to be able to count on somebody to open the door every morning. Whatever it is, those are things the organization needs to be able to count on someone for. And those accountabilities cluster into roles. So you create your organization based on what the organization really needs for it to be able to do its job well. So let me give you an example of how that worked for us at the Center for Human Emergence. When we'd had our first couple of years going on, working in a kind of early stage organization, and we got stuck around our governance. And so we took a decision to dissolve the whole formal structure of the organization. All that was left was me as the founder. We dissolved all the roles, the board, everything. So there was actually no formal organizational structure left. And we just sat back and watched what people started to do anyway in order to move towards the vision of the organization. Because you see, if the vision is really embedded in people and they really resonate with it, they're going to keep doing the things that are important, even if there's no formal structure in place to support it. So what we did after a while is sent a note out to everybody who was somehow engaged in the organization and asked them, what do you feel that the organization is counting on you now for? And so what came back was a very diverse list of things, from very concrete things to more abstract to more human elements. And so we gathered a whole bunch of accountabilities. So these seemed to be the things that at that moment in time, the organization needed to be able to count on somebody for to move forward. So we took those accountabilities and we clustered them naturally. There were kind of certain accountabilities that felt like they were supporting each other, that belonged together. And those became roles. And we gave the roles a title. And then we looked for people who were best suited to fit those roles to start to play them. So you can see how the design of our organization came very much from what basically the organization needed to be able to fulfill its mission. And then we, in the first few months, we noticed obviously there were gaps because we hadn't seen everything, and you started to create a few more accountabilities, a couple more roles, sharpen it up. But it really kept us very close to what was actually needed for the organization at this time based on what we were trying to do. Now, another key element in the organizational structure of this approach is organizing in what they call circles. So you have these roles with their accountabilities, and they become part of a circle. And so as you can see on this image, you might have your general company circle. So you've got many different people with their roles sitting in the circle. And it's like a cell, in a way, in the body. And it's like a cell which has a certain function in the organization. So those roles are working together in the circle for the purpose of that circle. So you would define what the purpose of that circle would be. So the general company circle, in this example, would be primarily about making the decisions, the kind of strategic and bigger decisions for the company as a whole, leading the company as a whole. Now, we started in the organization I was running with one circle to start with. It was a good idea to start with one and then see what the natural groupings are that emerge from those circles. So if in your meetings you find that there's a bunch of people who continually seem to gravitate together because they have shared interests, maybe they're all working on the development of a certain product, and that don't seem to be engaged in all the decisions, but they really have their beginning to create their own specific domain of practice, then that's a sign that that little group is ready to set up its own circle. So the circle, initial cell, might split, and you'd put out a new circle that has a particular sub-purpose, as it were, from the bigger company circle. In this case, maybe the development of a product for the company, or maybe more than one person is needed now to work on marketing. So you have a subgroup that evolves for marketing. And so what happens is that these new cells start to split out from the initial cell. And the question then becomes, how do you maintain the coherence between these different elements of the organization? And what they developed in holacracy, inspired originally by a process called sociocracy, is something called double linking. And the double linking process is, let's say your upper circle, your general company circle, needs to create a product development circle. Then that circle appoints what they call a lead link to lead that subcircle. And the accountability for that lead link is really to drive the vision of the upper circle in that subcircle. So to make sure that the macro vision, mission, purpose of the company is really embodied in that subcircle. Now that's a function that's very much a leadership function, you could say. What is often the challenge when you have just one person or one role leading a unit is that they're caught in a tension between what the upper circle or the bigger organization is saying about direction and the reality on the ground in their department. So they're having to hold in themselves both of those contexts. Well, we want to be going there, but the reality that we're experiencing is this, and that creates a tension. So in this approach, what you do is you split out these two roles. So you have one person as the lead link devoted to driving the vision forward, and then the sub-circle elects somebody from that circle to be what they call the representative link. And that person's job is to represent the reality in that department of the organization. And they join the lead link in the upper circle, in the next level of the organization. So that as you're just taking decisions at the higher level in the organization, you have both voices represented. You have the one who's responsible for driving the vision, but you also have a voice of the person who's very much connected to the reality in that context and can bring that information to the table. So that's the double linking. You always have a lead link and a representative link to lead, as it were, that unit and bring that perspective in. So having looked at this area of organizational control and organizational structure, we're now going to touch on organizational practices, particularly for meetings. And we're going to go into more detail on these in the following sessions, but just to cover the basics here. What this approach does is it splits out three different kinds of meetings: governance, operational, and strategic. And this is very liberating for these meetings because they really fulfill different purposes and therefore require and benefit from different approaches and structures to the meetings. So a governance meeting is really about how we run the organization. It's to do with the policies, creating new roles and accountabilities. If we don't know how to do something in the organization, then it belongs in a governance meeting. So that's quite requires reflection, requires a process that really makes sure we take into account as much information as possible, requires some depth in the conversation and some wisdom in moving forward. So that's dealing with those issues fits in the governance meeting structure. In the operational meetings, it's a very different energy because operations is really about the next actions that we're taking on everything. So how are we doing with the projects? What's our latest data on sales and those kind of things? How far have we got? Who needs to talk to who to make things move forward? It's really about the everyday actions, and you can feel it's quite a different energy to governance. Because governance, you really need a more reflective space, and operational, it's just touching base with each other on stuff, making sure we got the information, making appointments, and moving forward. So by splitting those out, it means you can create different organizational meeting processes that best serve the goals of those kind of meetings. Often those two things are mixed up with each other in meetings, and it creates confusion because you're trying to, a governance issue comes in and then an operational, and you have one person trying to facilitate the meeting in a certain way, whereas they would more benefit from a different approach. And then the final is strategic meetings, where you're talking about more long-term issues. So by splitting that out again, it means that in the governance meetings, you can really stay with the present tensions, with the operations really about the actions, and then anything which is longer term, you park in the strategic meeting box, which also has a certain design to it. What we're going to touch on in the next two sessions is how do the governance meetings work and how do the operational meetings work, to give you a sense of that process so that you can actually start practicing them yourselves in your own contexts. So that's the end of this session. You can move into some of the integration tasks now and make sure that you've understood some of the key concepts here before we go into more detail around these meeting processes.